to everyone around the world. Welcome to this webinar. My name is Giuseppe Ribaldi, and I am the president of the Moon Village Association, and I will be the moderator for this webinar. So first of all, let me thank the International Astronautical Federation for the support and for the organization of this event, which is taking place in the frame of Global Networking Forum ahead of the upcoming Congress in Milan, where we all hope to see you. So MVA, it's a non-governmental organization established in 2017 with the goal to put together stakeholders, industry, space agency, government from all parts of the world to try to cooperate on different topics in order to increase basically the cooperation and the coordination for the lunar, for peaceful, sustainable lunar activity. We are permanent observer at the United Nations COPUOS, and so we are able to bring issues related to the activity of the lunar exploration and utilization. Today, for the sake of time, I'd like to mention just a couple of activities which the organization is involved in, and the rest can be found on the MVA website. And in particular, I would like to mention the creation of the International Moon Day. This was the result of an initiative of the Moon Village Association, which proposed this basically the celebration of International Moon Day, that is 20th of July, to remember the landing of the moon, first landing of the moon, take this opportunity to interact between different organizations all over the world in a similar way like has been done for the World Space Week. So this was approved following a request from the Moon Village Association in 2021, and now is the third year the International Moon Day is taking place, and you're welcome to check on the International Moon Day website. The other important aspect is the issue related to lunar governance. You all know that there is a number of missions from many stakeholders around the world going to the moon and around the moon. And right now, there is no, let's say, name of the game, so no rule of the road to try to regulate, to coordinate the activity going to the moon. The OST, which is basically the Outer Space Treaty, which is the most important treaty of space activity, is very generic. And so we do need to try to define those kind of, let's say, attitude and behavior of the different stakeholders. For doing that, the Moon Village Association established the Global Expert Group on Sustainable Lunar Activity, GEXLA. This included a number of stakeholders from industry, space agency, government, as well as, of course, academia. And this operated in 2021-22, and it resulted in the publishing what is called Recommended Framework and Key Element for Peaceful and Sustainable Lunar Activity, which contains recommendation on how to behave around and on the moon. As a result of that, this was presented to the United Nations, and so there has been a lot of discussion at the level of the UN COPUOS, and we can consider that this activity has been a little bit the incubator of the, let's say, approval of the action team on lunar activity consultation, ATLAC, which has been approved this year, and which hopefully will start to operate next year as a first step in the direction of global coordination. Then basically, after this time, the GEXLA has dived in specific issues like the one that we are going to discuss today. And in particular, we have created in this operational phase 3 topics and 3 working groups: lunar environmental protection, lunar technical coordination, and then multi-stakeholder coordination. Today, in our panel, we have 2 of the co-chair. And so coming to today's webinar, we are going to discuss with this distinguished speaker, which represent two from industry and two from the science community, what are the issues at stake for sustainable lunar activity in order to start a process which require involvement of everyone. So without further doing, then I would like then to go to ask the first question to the speaker. So I will be asking a few questions to the speaker. We will hear from them. You are all welcome to put forward questions on your line on YouTube. And at the end of the main part, we will be able to answer your question depending to who is addressed. So I would now like to first go around for an introduction. So I will follow the list alphabetic order as it is in our poster. So therefore, I would like to give the floor to the first speaker, which will talk about himself and then about the organization, how relevant it is for the lunar sustainable activity. So the first on my list is Tim Chican from Lockheed Martin. So Tim, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Giuseppe. Hello, everyone. I'm the space exploration architect for Lockheed Martin, and I've also been involved with GEGSLA since the beginning. I'm the vice chair of GEGSLA for industry. I'm also the technical coordination working group co-chair. And at Lockheed Martin, we are working towards a lunar future right now today. The next flight of Orion is going to have crew. We've had our last uncrewed flight test, so very exciting. And I actually spent, before this role, about 10 years on the Orion spacecraft. So it's not PowerPoint graphics anymore. It's real pictures coming from the moon. And we at Lockheed Martin are planning for the sustained evolution segment of the Moon to Mars architecture right now. That is the future segment whose focus is economic activity. And so we are engaged because we want to operate on and at the moon, and we want to do it right. One thing I'll note for everyone, we recently released a short story, a novella, talking about our envisioned future from the perspective of a commercial astronaut. I'll put that in the chat for everyone to go ahead and follow and download. So thanks, Giuseppe. Giuseppe, you're on mute.
Sorry, I was muted. So thank you, Tim. And I go to the second speaker, which is Richard Green from International Astronomical Union. Richard, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Giuseppe. And so I am an astronomer at the University of Arizona, representing the International Astronomical Union. That is the International Professional Society for the world's astronomers. And it has as a primary mission to protect and enhance all aspects of astronomical research. So along those lines, they have recognized that the moon is a unique observational platform in the entire inner solar system for certain very special kinds of discovery. And we recognize that there are so many legitimate activities going on the moon that we're going to need to coordinate efforts to enable these kind of specialized observations. So I'll elaborate on them a bit later, but I'll just note that the Professional Society was established in 1919. It has about 13,000 members. We are also an observer organization at UN COPUS and are one of the stakeholders pleased to be engaged with GEGSLA. The main issue, and then I'll turn things back, is just as we have on Earth, astronomers seek remote mountaintops for optical observations where the sky is dark and the air is clear. They seek remote locations for radio telescopes where human broadcasts are at a minimum so that they can detect the faint signals from the universe. And they now detect gravitational waves, the actual distortions of the Earth. And they need quiet places where there isn't a lot of freeway and train traffic. And so finding those places and working on them on the moon is one of the main activities that we want to coordinate. So thanks very much.
Okay, thank you, Richard. So we go to the next speaker. It is Jim Caravala from Offworld. So Jim, the floor is yours, please.
Thanks, Giuseppe. Hi, everyone. I'm Jim Caravala at Offworld. At Offworld, we believe we're in a generational inflection and have significant responsibility over the next 10, 20, 30 years to really ensure we move out into the solar system as a species. We're building swarms of machine intelligent robots to undertake mining and construction operations here on Earth, and have already deployed several in pilot projects and moving into production over the next 2 years. We're now expanding that into our Lunar swarm robotic mining architecture. Our first robot, Prospector 1, will be launching in 2028 onto the lunar surface. It's a 3-ton multi-payload system for characterization, exploration, and prospecting. And it's extremely important that as we move out across the lunar surface, that we do this in a manner that allows continued operations, not only at the initial stage, but at scale. And so this is something I think we're all working towards extremely diligently as we think about how to do that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Jim. And then last, but of course not the least, Jean-Claude Verme from basically COSPAR. So Jean-Claude, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Giuseppe. Greetings, everyone. I am Jean-Claude Verme. I'm the Executive Director of COSPAR, the Committee on Space Research, formerly Chief Executive of the European Science Foundation, and I'm co-chairing the GEXLA Working Group 1 that Giuseppe mentioned earlier. COSPAR basically has been around as long as the space age itself, and we cover every aspect of space research, from Earth observation to life sciences. At a personal level, I've been involved in space research and policy for the past 30 years, and sustainable exploration, in particular of the moon, has been on my agenda for at least 15 years, and on COSPAR's agenda for probably longer. I was chairing, I remember, a session in the Bremen Assembly in 2010 on protecting the lunar and Martian environments for research, where speakers were already at the time addressing guidelines and legal aspects. For instance, mentioning the possibility to establish human-free areas on Mars, which is something that might come up again in the discussion. And the question of preserving the science on celestial bodies and in space is critical, for instance, to continue the search for life out there. But scientists are not alone up there anymore, and the playground must be shared. I would be tempted to add, or some would be tempted to add, whether we like it or not, as scientists. Already at the time, in 2010, the need to agree with all concerned stakeholders on a sequence of events well in advance to explore, settle on, and use other bodies with minimal local disturbance was addressed. There was no Space 2.0 at the time. Now we all know that some private stakeholders have demonstrated their worth and are part of the scenery. And all these categories of stakeholders have different priorities. So one key goal, in my view, is really to identify those priorities that are common to all or most of those stakeholders. And one might think that we couldn't find any of those, but I think the opposite. I think, for instance, the need for regulations, or at least for an operational framework, has been identified by every category of stakeholder, and I'm ready to expand on that. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, and thank you for this first round of introducing yourself. Now we start to dig a little bit more in the subject matter, and so I will now turn first, for practical reason, to the industry, since they are the one which eventually will go to the moon. And so the question is, what are the major industrial and technological challenges which you see, which are relevant and important for the lunar environment? So let's start with this question, then we will go to the scientists. So maybe we'll start this time with Jim and then going to Tim. So Jim, please.
Thanks, Giuseppe. Well, from an industrial deployment perspective, the real challenges are that although we can see prospective markets, the actual customers and the barrier to entry for those customers is significantly high now in 2024, 2025. To build production systems that are operating on a daily basis in the harsh lunar environment takes several $billion of capital investment. And the market justification, especially on the mining and extraction and processing side, is still thin for this decade. So we might see scale from the mid-30s onwards, which is not too long away in the development cycle. So with all of that capital that's needed, with all of that effort that's needed, it's the pressure is there to optimize that use of capital, which means then functions, non-revenue generating functions, such as management of dust, management of waste and excess activity on landing, on operations, creating regolith suspensions above the surface. The pressure can be on to reduce the engineering effort and the architectural design effort to solve those challenges. And so that's one first big challenge that we need to address at the meta scale. Secondly, when we're on the surface, the very nature of that environment, of course, is very damaging and hostile to our instruments, to very vulnerable and delicate sensors, to non-metallic rubbers and other materials that may be on the surface that we may use. So it behooves us to really think of the way to manage all of that environment carefully. And then finally, the point I care a lot about myself is that we intend to move at scale and in order to close the economics and the business model. The challenge is, as soon as you start landing on the surface, you disturb the environment. And we have a unique generational responsibility in human history and forever going forward, in that the first at-scale landings of equipment and systems and operations on the moon will forever change that environment. So as we land, we need to build into our business models the capture of as much data as possible of the pristine environment at every location, and perhaps even the allocation of areas of the lunar surface that we should try to preserve as wilderness reserves for posterity.
Okay, all right, Jim, thank you. So Tim, please.
Thanks, and I really agree with all of your points, Jim. The thing that I am working on along with the team is understanding what that future is going to be like. And for a true economy to be there on the moon, there needs to be a product that people on Earth are going to buy. And we're not quite sure exactly what that product is, and lots of folks have different ideas. We have our own. But we need to get to that point where we have a true economy and a true product. And because of all the difficulties that Jim mentioned, we need to be planning, designing, both from a technical perspective and a business case perspective right now for that future. And closing the business case includes the technical, the schedule, the financial, both risks and costs, and they can be high. So the business that we see on the moon is propellant as a product made from the water ice. But even today, right now, we are looking to our science colleagues to tell us where the water is and how accessible it is. But that product, propellant, can be used throughout the solar system, but most importantly in Earth orbit, for all of the economic activity that's happening in Earth orbit today, and that we are paying for with our various services today. So that's what we see. But there's lots of challenges. But businesses on Earth think in that 40-50 year time frame. And so we need to as well, and we know how to do that. And I think we need to engage, us in the space community need to engage those businesses on Earth that do that kind of long-term economic activity so we can get to that product.
Right. Okay. Thank you so much for the industry. Just to wrap up on this, there is a question on the chat, which is about, is our target 2040 to set a lunar base on the moon. Maybe I can just give a generic answer. First of all, we are talking about several infrastructure. And of course, we keep talking about the moon village because it's a multi-stakeholder. But of course, infrastructure on the moon, which is probably the most valuable sentence, is going to start to be implemented already in the next few years. So 2040 may be seeing people already living on the moon for a long period of time, but actual infrastructure will be there much earlier, as are already right now. So without further ado, I'll go now to the scientific aspect. And so the question to our science colleague is major scientific challenges relevant for the lunar environment. And so this time, let's get first Jean-Claude. Jean-Claude, please.
Okay, I'm first. Sorry, Richard. Well, industry is spoken for science, so let me speak for industry. The main the main challenge is to agree, in my view, between all stakeholders that critical science, as was just pointed out by Jim, I would add, radio astronomy from the moon, South Pole related research, those can be completely ruined if a phased sequence of events is not agreed upon by everyone in a sufficiently advanced manner. And there is a will on industry side to do that as well and try to answer the question, who can do what, where, and when? So to me, this is the main challenge. It's not just science, it's science and industry together that have a joint interest in meeting that challenge. Then Richard mentioned, or was it Jim? I can't remember, but sites of special interest. And this is really our next milestone here, is to be able to define sites, what we call sites of scientific special interest, SSSI. And, those are the places where we think valuable and critical science needs to be done, either before use is being planned and achieved, or in a way that can accommodate both science and use at the same time. But these sites need to be defined. And there are various types of research that need to be done. But maybe we can actually build upon the notion that we have seen encapsulated in the Artemis Accords of the safety zones to try to define some kind of safety zones for science. Now, whether it's the same kind of safety zones that you can find pictured in the Artemis Accords, I'm not sure. But the idea of having zones that are officially designed as scientific interest, special scientific interest sites, is critical, and that to me, that's the main challenge at this moment in time, not in 5 years, not in 10 years, now.
Okay, all right, thank you so much, Jean-Claude. Now, of course, Richard, the floor is yours.
Thanks. So I would say the highlight is exactly what Jean-Claude was saying, that finding a place for very sensitive observations free of interference from other legitimate activities is the main challenge here. And so, for example, there's treaty level agreement that the far side of the moon, which is shielded from Earth's broadcasts and for part of the time from the sun's emissions and for part of the time from Jupiter's powerful radio, is the quietest place in this side of the solar system to look at the highly redshifted, that is to say, low-frequency radio emissions from the early universe before stars or galaxies even formed. The challenge is that if routine operations and communication satellites don't shield their electronics, that whole frequency range is damaged by noise interference. And so there is a practicality of how you get a global operation limit on something as basic as just electronic circuitry to preserve that scientific capability. Similarly, there are permanently shadowed craters, which everybody desires. Jean-Claude mentioned pristine ices that encode the history of the solar system. Those craters haven't seen sunshine for about 4 billion years, so it's very cold. They are the perfect place to put a chilled telescope like James Webb Space Telescope. But if they're also attractive for mining and water extraction, we have to decide who does what. And finally, there is a new science of detecting gravitational waves, the distortion of shape, I'm sorry, as compact objects merge together. They detect distortions a tiny fraction of the nucleus of an atom. So they need a very seismically quiet place. Obviously, that's not consistent with landings, takeoffs, mining activities. So finding and preserving a seismically quiet zone is critical to those observations. So we need those operational collaborative approaches to define areas for specific activities. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much for this very interesting. So now I move indeed to more operational kind of question, and I will start maybe this time from the scientists, so that we have loops from the last one. And the question is, how, having heard what you said, how are we going to find a balance between science and industrial needs? I think this is one of the key questions. And so maybe I start again to be simple from you, Richard.
You've turned to the right person for a simple response. The way we get started the fastest is sitting down and discussing on the basis of the people who actually need to operate there, to start devising a set of practical working rules for how operations can actually go. So, Giuseppe, you mentioned ATLAC. That's the UN's initial approach to saying what kind of communication is at minimum necessary to know what everyone is doing. But we need ultimately to develop through practical means a process to say, here is an area that we're going to preserve to be seismically quiet. We all agree that there is a treaty obligation to protect low frequency radio from extra noise. So we're going to spend the extra bit of money and shield all the electronics that might be exposed to the far side. And we'll have to develop a cooperative means of saying, this crater is to study pristine ice. We get in and out, and Jean-Claude can talk about that. This crater will have a telescope in it and will not be available for mining. And these craters will be, perfect for exploration for this water extraction. So developing a way that we can sit down, cooperatively develop a plan, and then stick to it and have all the world stakeholders involved is our ideal goal here.
All right, thank you. So Jean-Claude?
Well, again, not much to add with respect to what Richard has just said. We need, on our side, first, we need to define the critical science that needs to be carried out, where and when, and how to phase that in a way that allows for use at the same time. We can do that as scientists first, and then include the industry. My own take would be to try to do that together as early as possible, because it cuts across, yes, many scientific disciplines, but it also cuts across many technological areas. And so we probably need to do that. The UN forum, although at the political level, seems to me to be the best forum to discuss, regulation and international norms of behavior, might not be the best for this agency/industry/scientist discussion. I don't know, but we certainly need to find a forum. I don't have a ready answer for that, but this forum will, which is not going to be a regulatory body, will have a normative role with respect to UN-USA, with respect to the agencies. For instance, concerning, Richard mentioned the area of radio quiet zones, but you can think about a lot of other aspects, like debris, for instance, space debris. I think we can all agree that we've generally not done a very good job of preserving the Earth. We need to correct that, but we also need to export into the solar system the lessons learned from not misusing the Earth into not misusing space. So creating debris in cislunar region is going to have an impact on operations as well. So this also needs to be addressed. So these fora, inter-industry scientist/agency fora, will have a normative role in the sense that they will need to discuss norms of behavior, not regulations. The regulations might come later, but norms of behavior. What needs to be done, have an inventory of what needs to be done from both sides, and then try to adjust that in a way that makes sense. You know, it sounds like, okay, then how you do it, I don't have the answer for that, but certainly we should start by discussing this together.
Right. Okay. And we will be able to come back to that in the last question. So the industry representative. So now, Tim, start with Tim this time, please.
One of the things that I think we need to think about is probably that this discussion around how we will find the balance practically is more in a tiered thing, in that, you know, the UN deals at the level of states, and we need to be involving more than states. So very important things maybe get done at the UN level, and then maybe the next level down is a method determined by the Artemis Accord nations and the ILRS. And then in the end, as a company, we operate under the laws of the United States or wherever a company is incorporated. So it's going to be this multi-tier thing to be able to have that conversation in order to, you know, decide how we're going to operate on the moon.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Jim.
I'd like to disagree to some extent. If any of this is going to work at all in the time frame that's going to be meaningful for creating systems to better manage our environment on Earth, I'm talking about the building of space-based solar power, taking lessons learned from closed cycle life support systems that operate at scale in space that we can bring down to Earth, etc., then we need to move fast. We need a sense of urgency at all levels, from the capital raising, from the business model creation, to the identification of the requirements for safety and environmental protection in space and on the moon. So I think the traditional way of doing things may be talking about the United Nations, interagency bodies and multinational institutions to collaborate and deliberate. But I'd like to see, before the end of the year, let's see from the scientific community a wish list of what would be on the lunar surface, the requirements needed that industry needs to look at and adopt and integrate into their business models for the protection of those zones. I'm sure Moon Village Association and COSPAR and other organizations really have that content. So let's get it out in the open rapidly, because I believe with the development of technologies, the underlying technologies necessary in machine design, manufacturing, in-space operations, propulsion, and then the robustness and longevity engineering that will be required for day-to-day, month-to-month operations on the lunar surface. I believe we are going to see successes much more rapidly than we had dared envisaged 5 or 10 years ago. The next 5 to 10 years may bring about rapid changes in technological approaches. So let's not let the regulatory and let's say our organizational inertia hold us back. So we should move quickly and generate momentum, get a sense of urgency in all aspects of this, and agree this quickly. I don't think it's that hard.
All right, thank you. So let me go then to the next question before we come to the final question. But there I will ask you to be a bit short, because then we can have more time for the final question, which is the way forward. So the next question is, what did you learn? Some of you already alluded. What did you learn from Earth environmental issues that are relevant for the moon? And so again, let's start with the inverted order. So again, maybe let's start with Jim.
So as we've been putting our robots in underground mines, issues of operational longevity, cascading errors in the autonomy and decision-making, the dust that comes off the rock that interacts with robots, covers the lenses of cameras, All of these lessons are already very interesting and important to us. Management of thermal, even though the mines that we operate in currently have an atmosphere, thermal management is critical. And so everything that challenges us in the unknown at the systems level of our machines is an environmental issue in parallel. It's the environmental questions that we need to raise out of responsibility. We directly are affected by those same challenges with our systems. And we wouldn't want damage to occur to other institutional systems or the environment that we're seeing on our robots. So there's very valuable lessons to be learned by operating on Earth first.
Okay, thank you. Now let's mix. So maybe let's go to Richard. So we have one and one. Richard.
There are interesting differences too, I have to say. The one way in which we are making slow progress on environmental considerations on Earth is recognizing that the environment has multiple aspects. And so light pollution on the ground actually has environmental effects on animals, on nocturnal animals and plants and so on, but it's not considered at the moment as part of the entire package. And so our own field is having a debate about how extensive is the Earth and its environment? Does it extend well into space? Does it extend to the moon? Because we have an astronaut on our committee who says the environment is where people are. And so, anything that impacts human presence is an environment that has to be carefully considered. So I think we bring those concepts with us when we talk about human presence on the moon.
Right, thank you. And there is initiative like the one also again from the Moon Village, which is called Moon for Earth, which is really trying to integrate basically the moon and the Earth environment. Now let's go to Tim. Tim, please.
I think one thing that we've learned is that at a big scale, we need to address environmental issues from the beginning. In the 1800s, at the start of the Industrial Revolution, there were basically no laws. And we didn't understand many things, so that makes sense. But today we need to address it right away because in order for industry to operate, we need regulatory stability. Rules are fine as long as it's a level playing field. And the last thing we want is to mess it up and then have a moratorium on commercial lunar activity. And that activity is going to benefit everyone, particularly as we build infrastructure. Science will be able to plug in and power their radio telescopes, things like that. So I think that the biggest thing is don't ignore it, address it right away.
All right, thank you. Jean-Claude?
The answer, as everybody has said, is don't mess it. Do not do unrepairable harm to celestial bodies, except where absolutely vital for humankind. But I can't see at this point where it would be vital to do that. So that's the generic answer. More specifically regarding the moon, I mentioned it already at the beginning, debris. Having these activities is something that we know is causing problems around the Earth. So that's a lesson learned from the Earth that we don't want to bring to the lunar exploration. We need to find ways to remediate the debris problem. And it's not easy. Agencies that are trying to reduce the number of debris are finding today, for instance, that just the orbiting debris creates problems of its own in the atmosphere. We don't have that on the moon. But addressing these issues is clearly one specific lesson learned from Earth that we don't want to be transposed back on the moon. Jim mentioned the dust for operating machinery on the moon, but let's remember that also the lunar dust might be toxic for humans when we have humans there. So this is clearly one area where we want to have added knowledge built in.
Okay, so thank you. Now we come to the final question because time is wrapping up and we have a number of also questions from the audience. So we're going to deal. So the last question, and I like to use the reverse order. So you will be the first one, Jean-Claude. So way forward. So we heard a lot about all these issues. We are at the beginning of a process. So what do you see way forward, and what is a possible role of your organization? So let's start with Jean-Claude, please.
So the way forward, we've started to debate this, weighing in the advantages and disadvantages of the various fora, existing fora, UN, national agencies coordinating their approach, the Artemis Accord, ILRS, national laws extended to all spacefaring nations, whatever. There are obviously various pros and cons, but to me, the last four I mentioned, the disadvantages, for instance, the fact that the agency represent only spacefaring countries and not the whole of the Earth's population. For Artemis Accord, ILRS, China and Russia or the US not in and not likely to get in. For national laws, what happens if countries don't pass appropriate laws? So those disadvantages overwhelm, in my view, the advantages. So for the necessary discussion that will need to be put in place regarding formal regulation about exploration and use of the solar system, we need the UN. I think there's no other way. And of course, organizations like IAU, COSPAR, GEXLA, etc., will have a very important input there, but also the industry. So that's a privileged vessel. But as we said, and as I think Jim mentioned, in the very short term, because regulation will take time, we need some kind of privileged vessel to discuss and agree on those matters and find a way to do it that's not, completely inflexible and doesn't require 20 years to be approved. So these norms of behavior, which are more of an operational framework, need to be discussed very quickly amongst the various stakeholders. And I think that Jim's approach to say, basically, the science community could come up with some kind of lists of what to do, where, and when is actually a good starting point, because it's not an ethical framework, it's not norms of behavior, it's not regulation, but it provides input to the industry, which we are seeing today, at least for those representatives here, are actually supporting this approach of preserving the environment. So starting there is a good idea, I think.
Okay, all right, thank you, Tim. Maybe in a minute or so, please.
Yeah, I think, we need to, as we're talking about here, to move beyond talking about the problem to getting to a real plan. Where there is a sense of urgency here. And as we learn more about the moon, as we do the science missions, we're going to have to adjust that plan. So we'll need to have a mechanism for constant communication as we learn new things. But in the end, our conversations need to be leading towards, policies at the UN level and regulation at the country level in order to have that stability. So it is quite the challenge.
Okay, all right. So I think the next one is, I would say, Richard, and then the last would be Jim. So Richard, please, shortly.
So the IAU is taking Jim's challenge very seriously, and our working group is convening all the project and concept leads that we know within the next 6 months to flow down the requirements of their mission, sit down with lunar cartographers and say, what are the prioritized lists of sites that we had in mind for the ultimate build out of these next generation facilities, so that we have something very specific to talk about and then can sit down and start talking.
All right, thank you. So Jim?
In my view, the clock is running from a geopolitical, resources, food, fresh water, and environment management here on Earth. By middle of this century, by 2050, I want to see human civilization have all the tools and systems necessary for expansion anywhere into the solar system. That's a base set of infrastructure. In order to do that, we can measure that by probably approximately a 10% increase in global GDP due to that additional space economy. So an additional $10 trillion. That should include space solar power, lunar manufacturing, extraction, and processing, and the transport and energy power and propellant systems in place in cislunar space for that foundation. So with that in mind, we can operate with a sense of urgency for our investors and stakeholders to say, all of us, scientific community, institutions, industry can be part of this system and architecture. And so we need to move quickly now with those sets of requirements. We need to mobilize rapidly and move at scale in where we are literally mobilizing over the next 5 to 10 to 15 years, several $100 billion of investment to service not only where we see ourselves going in space, but the terrestrial energy, the terrestrial mineral, and the terrestrial food and freshwater industries due to space-based benefits and systems.
All right, so thank you. So I think we have now come to the end of our nominal time. So I think I would like to extend about just a few minutes before we come to the final conclusion. There are a number of questions that I like to bring to the attention of some of you. So let me go quickly. So there's one for Tim. Maybe you already read that one on your chat. So Tim, maybe you can answer. Is about how big do you think the market for propellant might be by middle of 2030s?
Yeah, so by the middle of the 2030s, I think the market signals will be there, in particular when the human landing systems land to bring astronauts. They could definitely take advantage of tens to hundreds of tons of propellant there on the surface. I think we'll be a little challenged, though, by the mid-30s to have infrastructure up and running at that point. I think we'll be growing. We really think it's the 2040s, also when we're starting to do Mars human exploration, that we're really beginning to industrial scale. You know, just one Mars mission would require, 200, 300, 400 tons of water or hydrogen and oxygen propellant production per year. And so it into the 2040s and 50s is when we start getting into hundreds and then thousands of tons.
All right, okay, thank you. So let's go to the list of the questions. The next question is, which country are going to be major potential space power in the future? So I don't know if anyone wants to take this question.
I'll give that a quick shot.
Okay.
I don't believe we're going to be defining access to space and growth opportunities in space on a national level. I think the playing field will level out within the next 10 years, where the base technologies are going to become commoditized, and it will be agencies, national startups and companies and OEMs in those countries will all have access to the basic tools, just like companies today have access to trucks, hand tools, power tools, and systems. It's just whether they can close the business model.
Okay, anyone wants to add? Jean-Claude, you want to add? I think you are starting.
Well, yeah, maybe. Maybe. Many countries do not have the means to do that in the way that you described, Jim, I think. At least today. It might change. And yes, there are countries where there are systems in place that are not necessarily that efficient that will resort to that kind of approach. But in the next few years, I think you will still see a number of countries, ramping up their capabilities in terms of space business, like, UAE, of course, Egypt, more generally, South African countries, Singapore, Brazil, maybe. But yeah, I mean, I understand what you're saying. I just think it might not be immediate everywhere.
Okay, well, and just if I may add from my side, I think the moon is of a general interest, and we have seen with many activity a lot of developing countries being interested in the moon, and we have to make sure that we have capacity building in those countries to participate. Now, let's go to the next question. There are two questions which I think we can group together, which are science related. So I guess, so the question is, the public has a deep curiosity about life in the universe, and why don't we focus on more astrobiology and looking for possible life in the universe? But then the same question is, setting up on the moon, it is cool, but should not be our main priority in space, or should we be more focused on the search for extraterrestrial life? So I think the issue of life outside Earth. So maybe I'll ask maybe Richard and then Jean-Claude to answer the question. Please, Richard.
I agree with the person who asked the question that this is a major issue of scientific curiosity. I think that the moon is the best platform for the next generation of observational instruments to try to answer that question, because right now there's Habitable Worlds Observatory planned by NASA for the 2040s, and there are the next generation of 3 large telescopes being built on the ground, but we need yet another step in capability to directly image an Earth-like planet in the habitable zone of its host star and see if its atmosphere has been chemically transformed by life. Having an array or a large aperture telescope in one of these permanently shadowed craters, so it's naturally cold, it doesn't have an atmosphere, it can watch the entire orbit of that Earth-like planet at high contrast. That's the next step. So the moon is the place to go to do that very problem.
So that's so you want to add anything, Jean-Claude?
I would say that to an extent we're doing that already, and actually our concern with the growth of the space exploration business and the addition of new stakeholders is that precisely that search for life in the universe, astrobiology in general, is not endangered in some areas by some unregulated practices. COSPAR, for instance, is in charge of what we call planetary protection, which is basically, it has nothing to do with protecting the Earth against aliens, but it is about being careful, mindful about biological contamination of celestial bodies, including the Earth. That's what we call forward and backward contamination. And so we do that, and we establish guidelines to make sure that we don't disrupt the environment because we want to search for life. So this is very much a priority in our case. And going to the moon might not be that significant in this regard, but there are some scientists who disagree with that, by the way. But certainly going to Mars and doing it in a way that preserves existing condition is critical. And so yes, we're doing that, and I agree with you. It's important. It's not just nice and cool. It's very important for science.
Yeah, and so just to wrap up on this question, I mean, it's cool, it's interesting, but I think going to the moon, that's the answer which I gather from you guys, is basically the right place to start for looking for life, extraterrestrial life, because we'll give tools and possibility which are not any longer not available on Earth. So let me then try to go to the last question, because I don't see any other. This is more on the industrial side. The question...
Tim wanted to say something about astrobiology.
Sorry, please. Sorry, Tim.
Oh, the only point I wanted to make was that the resources that come from the moon may be necessary to find life in the universe, in that if we need to build a very large telescope to directly image an exoplanet, we might want to build that in space from lunar regolith, silicon or aluminum. If we're going to be having extensive operations at Mars, robotic or human, we will likely want to have the propellant from the moon such that we can do that search for life more sustainably.
Right. Okay. Thank you. So let's go to the last question, as I said, which is it is more realistic to see if market of the lunar industry on the moon or on the Earth. It is more realistic to see the market of lunar industry on the moon or on Earth. So maybe, Jim, you can go to this one.
True markets occur where people exist.
Right.
Initially, the majority of people are on Earth. So if there are ways to provide end user value to people on Earth from the moon, that becomes optimal for business models. One way to then gain that principle is to push back the frontier of the market so that there are more people on the moon. And then we can increase the lunar to lunar end user business transactions.
All right. So, Tim, since it's an industrial consideration market, you want to add anything?
Not really. Where the people and the capital are is where the market is. And yes, someday we'll get to a really robust lunar market, but it will start at the Earth.
All right. So, okay, gentlemen, I think we are coming to the end. So we have already extended for 10 minutes. So let me try to summarize. So I think, first of all, I'd like to thank again IAF. I'd like to thank the speaker for this very exciting. We have to be clear, this is the start of a long process, as you heard, and it has been sketched. So I think organizations like Moon Village Association, COSPAR, IU, and International Astronomical Union, and others, we are working together already. And I think this is important to be clear to the public. We are talking to each other, as you can see from the conversation of today and many others. And so we are able to basically to exchange information and to make proposals also to the official organization like the United Nations. So as I said, this is the start of the process. At the meeting in Milan, there is going to be many of those issues discussed today in many of the sessions. And so therefore, I think please look out, first of all, again, as a Moon Village Association, but all the other organizations are working on that. So follow our website. And if you are interested, you can always get in touch with us via, let's say, the relevant connection with website. And so with that, I like to close by basically hoping to see all of you in Milano, where is going to be a great international astronautical congress, which is going to break all the records according to the prediction of our colleague from the IAF. So make sure to be part of this. And of course, I like to say what the Italians say, being Italian, arrivederci in Milano. And thank you so much for being with us today. Bye-bye then.
Thank you.